it is very tempting to start drama because that's how the attention economy works. I don't think it's a 21st century phenomenon. Suddenly everything's like low quality garbage.
Nostalgia is a yearning for a time that really never existed.
People are trapped in like these nostalgia traps and they don't update themselves.
There's a cultural lag attached to everything, right?
I think people really underestimate what that lag is going to be with AI. A successful plumber in like a big city could be making six figures, but somehow the journalist has more power.
Now we've moved to the age of mass personalization.
I think we're a lot more malleable than we think.
You could have a wonderful life if you really love what you're doing in a way that you never could have in the past.
If you play your cards right, it's much more sustainable.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. Today's guest, actually, I had to reschedule several times, but it's going to be interesting because you are now going to be proved quite almost a seer with the article that I wanted to talk to you about.
Yes.
My guest today is Katherine Dee, who writes at Default Wisdom as well as numerous other publications. Katherine, welcome.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for accommodating the rescheduling.
No worries. So before we get into with the item that's going to show how prescient you are, give us your origin story. Tell us about you.
I'm a blogger. I blog about internet culture and internet history. I'm almost a journalist. That's not quite the right word for what I do, since it's less reporting and more like I call my Substack thought digests, because it's little things I've been thinking about. So it's more like observations or field notes really than journalism per se.
And yet you are published in a lot of sort of blue chip journals. So
yeah, I mean, I've been very lucky. I'm lucky that people want to read my thoughts.
Yes, you are. Was that your original goal? Did you want to be a journalist, or did it evolve?
It sort of evolved. I wrote an internet culture newsletter for an ad agency I worked for. I worked a little bit in entertainment and tech, and then I worked at a startup that, as startups tend to do, it collapsed on the night that I just started writing full time.
I love that. As startups tend to do, it collapsed. It reminds me of the line by Ben Stein's father, Herbert Stein, and it goes something along the lines of unsustainable trends tend not to sustain themselves. So
yeah,
maybe we could apply that to startup culture. Okay, well, the reason I was really excited to have you on was you published an article that basically said why you're not leaving Twitter during the times when everyone was like setting their hair on fire and saying, I'm done. I'm not going to ever be on this accursed website ever again. Of course, only to see them again the next morning. And I was fascinated by your article. So that got published back during the summer. And I read it and I loved it and I agreed with it. And I thought, wow, I really want to do a deeper dive on this. But let's remind listeners and viewers, during that time, Elon was doing some pretty crazy things, renaming, doing all sorts of experimentation, et cetera. And everyone was literally losing their minds. And then you came with very clear eyes, in my opinion, and said, come on, guys. Don't try to fool yourself. You're not going to leave Twitter. Why?
I mean, the people it's usually journalists who claim they're leaving, right? And the only reason they're there is to push clicks or move books or, it's like it's a professional tool. And then even so I feel like Twitter is really a like distribution site. So if you're not a journalist, you're sort of like a journalist in waiting, right? Like you're selling takes. And there's a reason that you chose Twitter. It's a proximity to people who are going to read that and care about what you have to say, right? So it doesn't make sense, right? For a lot of people, it's like their main source of clout. Sometimes, professional meaning, sometimes just meaning. And they're not going to do it on TikTok. They're not going to quit, right? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And you had some just killer lines in there. Like, and this, I'm paraphrasing you here. So, New York is dead. A lot is happening in Austin or Denver. Which,
Yes.
but to somebody like myself with a admittingly New York centric sensibility, I really thought that was really funny. Has it surprised you to see all of the people who moved away from New York are suddenly announcing they're moving back to New York?
I mean, that's happening to San Francisco too, right? All the people who had to jack up the prices in Miami are suddenly like, oh, California is not that bad. It's really hard to change a center of gravity, right? And it's never going to be really, like, Twitter is the only exception where it's like remote, because you need some barrier to entry. And, for New York, the barrier of entry is like 1, getting to New York, 2, affording to live in New York, 3, finding the places where people who, have whatever cachet you're looking for are, right? You can't move that to Miami or LA right? It's like those center of gravities have been static for a while for a reason.
Yeah. And snowing points as well, right? Like San Francisco, the Bay Area, Silicon Valley for certain types of people. New York, I've always thought of as more of an idea, and it draws people who love ideas and love thinking about stuff. And I have a good friend who's actually not from here, never lived here, and he's planning on moving here. And I asked him when he was here visiting, I said, "Why are you moving here?" And he goes, "It's where all of the smart people are." And in a way, is Twitter kind of the cyberspace equivalent? Like, if New York is the capital or the intellectual capital of America, if not, much of the world, is Twitter kind of the capital of cyberspace?
I wouldn't say it's the capital. It's the capital for a certain type of person, I think. I think there's a couple of cliques, right, or factions that get the most out of Twitter. So, I mean, it depends on what you want. So if you want to be a writer, certainly. If you want to write op-eds, Twitter is the place. If you want to, peddle takes, Twitter. If you want to be a political personality, Twitter. If you want to be a podcaster of a certain kind, Twitter. What's interesting about the internet is there's all of these celebrities with like massive audiences, but they don't have more traditional forms or like legacy forms of social capital. I have a friend who's an incredibly popular YouTuber. His subscribers into the millions, right? And he's like, I don't know how to get important people to notice me. And that's that's cyberspace in a nutshell. Certain forms of celebrity are more valuable than others. And Twitter is very valuable if you have particular goals.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting about your friend. So, number one, is his YouTube channel one that where he would really benefit by having, in quotes, I'm doing air quotes here for the people who are just listening, important people notice him, or is that just kind of like a status game thing?
I think it's a status thing. I think you want to feel like your work is meaningful. And at some point, making money isn't enough. There's this sort of like classic thing that comes up on Twitter a lot, right? Where it's like, a successful plumber in like a big city could be making 6 figures. And then you have a journalist who is barely scraping by, but somehow the journalist has more power, right? And it's the same kind of thing. Like my friend, it's a hobbyist channel, and it's very appealing for the people it's supposed to appeal to. But he's never going to get like, I'm just picking random names here. Like Lizzo is never going to like stumble across his channel and be like, hey, like you're doing, I mean, she might, but like, realistically, or maybe like some venture capitalist or something. It's just like very unlikely. And so he feels like I'm doing so well, but it feels somehow like it's lacking that like traditional marker of success. And Twitter really gives you access to that based on who's using it.
Yeah, I think that Twitter is really interesting. I used to do a ton of legacy media. I did a lot of CNBC, CNN, did interviews with like major newspapers and stuff. And then I don't know, about 2015, 16, I kind of decided I have this thesis, which I call the Great Reshuffle, and where all the old playbooks are basically getting burned and they really don't work anymore. And that's why they're getting burned. And so I kind of decided, I think I'm going to shift just to social media and see how that goes out. Because the business I used to be in, asset management for other people, which I sold and then started this new company, the change there was ridiculous. So like in 2006, 7, if you were in asset management or anywhere really for that matter on Wall Street, you couldn't have a Twitter account. Compliance wouldn't allow it. And so everyone had one, of course. I didn't ever have one that was under a pseudonym, but I had a lot of friends that did, and it was just accepted that they had to because their companies would let them do it. But then it shifted in like 10 years, where I was reading something about asset managers and things, and they say if you don't have a Twitter account, like you're not going to make it because FinTwit is what they call that little section of Twitter, blew up. And part of my thesis was that we are increasingly living on the internet and in cyberspace, and very difficult to move your physical zip code, very easy to move your digital zip code. But I want to talk a little more about status because I just read something you were writing about that I thought was really interesting. The whole idea that gets confused in a lot of people's minds is like rich does not equal high status, as
Right.
you just pointed out with the plumber versus the journalist. It seems to me that journalists, especially of legacy media, they made almost an implicit deal. And the implicit deal was, you know what? I'm not going to make a ton of money, but I am going to have influence, right? Which is a much different form of status or prestige than money. Sometimes, arguably, much more important. And do you think that's one of the reasons why that we see kind of a meltdown on the part of many older legacy media stars?
I think partially. I mean, yeah, that's part of it. I don't know if it's going to come to pass in exactly this way, but I think that journalists probably have like a good shot at like a class action lawsuit or something against their employers, because if you want to write a book or something, right? Like you need a big platform, and it's not enough simply to say I work for the New York Times or I work for the Atlantic. You need to be a personality, right? And that was a change that happened in my lifetime. I remember I was like in college, and it started to be that journalists had to be personalities, and the craft of journalism was secondary. So you take someone like, for example, Taylor Lorenz, who I think is actually a really, really good journalist, and she has like a wonderful memory for internet culture. She really knows her stuff. But when I say Taylor Lorenz, people immediately think of her social media drama, right? And she's not forgettable. And it was sort of like this devil's bargain. But part of that bargain is she has to become a joke to move books, to have these high profile positions, to get her point across, and then incur, I believe she is harassed, right? Incur harassment for her behavior. And then it's like, no, I don't think anyone can name a single article that she's written, which is a shame because her work is actually like quite good, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just like this weird thing where like lots of journalists are in this position, and it's sometimes it's a flawed personality. I don't know this. I don't know her personally. I've never spoken to her. I have no idea what she's like. But I mean, it is very tempting to start drama because that's how the attention economy works. And I would imagine that a lot of people are in this position where journalists have to make a fool out of themselves in a way to sustain people's attention, because people may not be as interested in like a thoughtful tech piece, right? And then it's everything else is secondary, and that's a lot of stress. And I think that adds to the meltdown, because not everyone is like, I certainly am not good at being like an internet personality, right? But at the same time, if I was not an internet personality, I would not be in this interview right now. It's difficult for people who think of themselves as writers or anthropologists or basically anything else besides an entertainer to pursue that life.
There was a great documentary where they were talking about it was a documentary on Kurt Vonnegut. And John Irving gave a quote on the documentary that I really was taken by. And he said that when they were teaching at the most prestigious, I think the Iowa School of Writing, or one of the really super highly prestige ones, and Irving had got to know Vonnegut, and he said something that I always remember, and it was this. He goes, "It's absolutely fine to write about deadly serious stuff, but you better be fucking entertaining."
Yeah.
Do you subscribe to that? I mean, because one of the things I like about your reading is you are very entertaining.
Thank you. I mean, you have to sustain people's attention somehow. And I think for a lot of, myself included to some extent, your personal life and your personal baggage, whether real or imagined by your audience, that's another thing, right? The lore that people write for you versus what you have, constructed for yourself, is really important. And so you constantly have to negotiate. Well, like, oh, I'm a joke, but if I wasn't a joke, I wouldn't be able to pay my mortgage with Substack or or whatever, right? Whatever thing it happens to be for any given individual.
Yeah, but the other thing that I think about a lot is, when everything is digitized, right? You can't copyright reality. You can't copyright that tweet that was a real banger. And so what can't you create with zero marginal costs? You can't create your reputation. You can't create authenticity. You can't create trust. You can't create all of the things that I think would argue about maybe really thinking deeply about making yourself a joke on social media in terms of to be memorable. Do you think there are other ways that you can do that and also succeed?
I think rarely people are successful because of the quality of their work. But it does seem rare. I mean, there's so many like bloggers who sort of, are just stuck in obscurity, and it's not that their writing isn't good. It's just that they lack something that makes them, pop. But I mean, I think that's probably true. That's something that's been true to different degrees forever. Like, you always hear these stories of like these like very talented subway musicians, and they just, died, just collecting, tips in a cap or something. And to some extent, it's like, it's not really their fault. It's like there's a lack of an it factor or something. And it sucks, right? It's some of it's just luck. And there's plenty of people who have no talent, who, because they have a really good stage presence or they knew the right people or something, somehow like willed their way into these incredible positions.
Yeah, that makes me think of two things. On the first, there was a great piece that I read about the artist Basquiat. I've collected contemporary art for a long time, and I don't own any of his work, but I was really intrigued by his work as an artist. And then I read this piece that basically said that he had a partner. He was originally a graffiti artist,
right?
And he had a partner whose work was so similar to his that they themselves could not tell who did what part of a thing, right? But the point of the piece was Basquiat got befriended by Andy Warhol and became part of his circle, right? And his friend was like, no, that's selling out. I'm not going to do it. Well, of course, Basquiat started selling paintings for millions and millions of dollars, and his friend still completely in obscurity. Same talent, completely different results based on the point you're making.
Yeah, I think that happens all the time. And it creates resentment, right? It's just the way it is. There's a finite amount of attention, right? And it's also, I also think in a way it creates weird situations, like my friend who is like, he's very good and he's the best within his particular niche. But his niche doesn't have wide appeal, nor has someone sort of reached out and made it have wide appeal. Like another thing that I think could happen to him is like, let's say, for example, some random celebrity is really interested in his hobby and sort of turns it into a trend. And then he already has all this power behind him. But it just, it's just like playing the lottery.
Yeah. And the second thing that it reminded me of what you said was, have you ever seen, it's very old and you're young, so I doubt you've probably seen it, but have you seen the movie Broadcast News?
I haven't, but I was supposed to watch it in college and I never did.
I would recommend watching it because it really was also prescient in that the setup is William Hurt is this very good, during his Glamour Boy days, is this very, very good looking guy. And like he's smooth delivery, like looks like the anchorman from Central Casting. And then Albert Brooks, I think, plays the guy who's the nerdy, like he's singing songs in, Catalonian and making this funny stew and listening to several different news sources and processing them all at the same time. And he's just as smart can be. And of course, we all know who gets the anchor slot, right? William Hurt gets it. And it turns out that the nerdy guy becomes his brain. And William Hurt always wears an earpiece, and the nerdy guy basically just tells him what to say. I mean, it's kind of weird, but there does seem to be some truth in that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's also there's interesting phenomenon, especially like on Twitter, much smaller scale, right? Of like pretty women or like women who are like pretty presenting. They may not actually be pretty, having like smarter, funnier men. I mean, this sounds so sexist as it's coming out of my mouth, but having these ghostwriters that are like, men who at least understand the medium, or I don't want to say they're necessarily actually funnier or smarter or anything. And then together, right? They like the woman harnesses her sexuality and the man harnesses knowing the medium and knowing how to create a good joke, and they become these powerhouses. And it's always like very small scale, right? But it's a similar sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't either noticed or given that thought. That is like really interesting. Let's go a little bit back to the piece you recently wrote, social status and wealth class, and how class does not equal wealth. Americans have always been very squeamish about talking about class, because ultimately, right, if you go back to the founding, that's what we were ostensibly rejecting, right? Everyone is equal under the law, blah, 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 you come here. And yet it does seem to me, I had Will Storr, the author of the Status Game, on. I love his work. And the reason I've read all of his stuff, but I had him on for that book because I had kind of consistently tried to convince myself that hierarchy meant nothing to me and that I never signaled, and et cetera, et cetera. And then after reading all of Will's work and my friend Rob Anderson, I'm like, fuck. Yeah. I had always thought that like my goal was to stand outside of the hierarchy. But then like if you start studying evolution, you start studying other species, like literally there are status hierarchies everywhere, from hens to baboons to ants and bees and we humans. What do you think? How would you sort the difference between class on the one hand? Paul Fussell has a really hysterically funny, but a little bit old, so a lot of the references are not great, book called Class, A Guide Through the American Class System. And it's always been something I've been myself squeamish to talk about because it's really hard. What is class? What is prestige? What is status? And why do people continually link them to money?
I think, often they are connected. They're just not always connected, especially in the United States, where theoretically anyone can become super wealthy, right? That's the beauty, allegedly, of this country. When anyone says that class and wealth are the same, right? I think immediately of some hypothetical new money family in Long Island who still has all the trappings of a middle class Italian American family, but they also can afford a Ferrari or something. I'm well, that's not really high class. And I don't know why that's my knee-jerk thing that I think of, but I feel those families exist, right? And there's lots of them. I think of so I always went to prep schools growing up, and I went to a college with sort of a similar flavor. And there was a lot of people with money, but you knew the difference between someone who simply could afford to attend that school, and then there was some other secret layer of society that only a few kids actually had access to, right? And then it's even you can even tell based on what prep school people go to. Oh, you go to the best school within your particular city, but you still don't go to Andover or Exeter or something, right? It's hard to describe to people who haven't seen it. It's just it's just the difference between my dad drives a Porsche and is friends with Hillary Clinton. It's it's just a weird thing that you kind of once you notice it, it's I'm sure it is something that can be articulated, but I personally don't have that skill set. It's just it's access to just something else. There's real power, real influence or something.
So let's go further on that. You mentioned you went to prep schools. Did kids that you knew then emerge in life kind of the way you thought they would based on what you observed?
Most people, right? I think there's a certain type of kid who it's you knew pretty early on they'd be doctor, lawyer, finance, right? And then you knew a kid really came from status, really was high class if they could go study Egyptian history and now they're a career artist, right? Another thing was everyone could technically afford the same things, but then randomly there'd be some senior who could go to the Met Gala, and it's you don't even know, most are how do you even get invited to something like that? That's more than money, right? That's a level of access that you can't even conceive of, right? Even if, and then there's little dog whistles, right? Do you play tennis or do you play squash? There's all these little things that kind of are dog was can your parents simply afford to send you here, or are you from a special family? It fucked me up when I was growing up because I just I was I could never figure out why am I different? Right? I'm a spoiled kid just like everyone else. And then I was oh, just my dad just has a good job, but we're not special. And then I just never, and I know that this is, this isn't these aren't new revelations. People have been writing on this for hundreds of years. I just never, I harbored these feelings of confusion my whole life and then never took the time to educate myself on it.
I love the dog whistles. Again, back to my friend Rob Henderson. He has a book coming out. He had a rough childhood, raised in foster homes, but super smart guy. And so he as he would self-describe it, was like a burnt-out fuck-up from Northern California, who like had a wake-up call, joined the Air Force, and then got accepted to Yale. And talking to him about Yale, and it's in his book, so I'm not saying anything that he hasn't already said himself. He one of the things that he noticed was he said, I felt like I spoke a foreign language when I got to Yale. He said all of the kids knew like what references to the West Wing and all of these other popular shows. And he said, like, I had never heard of, much less seen any of these shows. And so like, he's a researcher, right? So he does the download on West Wing and he does the download on all of these. So like I learned, interestingly, Mad Men and Mad Men in particular had like one of the highest ad rates because it was reaching an audience that like luxury goods manufacturers, that was their sweet spot, right? And I wonder, like, how did you experience that with well, you wouldn't have, but did you know people who experienced the kind of like, holy shit, are you guys even speaking the same language as me?
There's sort of, I've had an experience. So I feel like I'm kind of like in the middle, right? Like I'm not really in the core group, but I've always sort of been like an orbiter, right? And then there's people who are totally outside that. So like in college, I was like very good friends with this woman. She came from like, like a middle class suburb in New Jersey. And then there was like, that was really stark because we had another friend who was like super wealthy, grew up in Asia, like totally different. So like there was me who grew up in Palm Beach County, this girl who grew up in suburban New Jersey, and then this other girl who was just like totally on another planet. And then seeing the things that like I was aware of, I was aware I didn't have access to, but I knew it existed. And I knew what the social norms around it were, but I knew that it wasn't for me. And then just like the total ignorance of our other friend from New Jersey. It was like, that's when I was like, wow, there's really like, there's so many worlds like going on that, and just, it kind of like put how out of touch I was into perspective. And then like how out of touch in a way that we all were, right? Just like completely unaware to everyone's situation. I don't know if I explained that particularly well, but so sort of, it's similar to what Rob experienced, where it's just like, you don't even know how other people are living because it's just, there's so many layers of it.
As you were talking, I was thinking, if you had any aspirations for fiction, that'd be kind of a great book, I think. Like intentionally mixing up people from really, really different backgrounds. And like, I don't know, I'm not going to write it here. You would write it much better. But like, and then kind of seeing how literally you, because you lack a shared context, you lack the ability to understand one another.
Right. And like, you think the other person's lying, or like, you think you just don't understand how certain things could be true. And you'd get into these like bizarre, like very esoteric arguments about things. I mean, like one thing that like we would all argue about is just like the etiquette around certain things. One thing, I don't remember anything in particular. I remember there being like lots of really stupid ones. One argument I got into recently that was sort of in the same spirit is like, do you send a courtesy invite, right, to a large event? And then it's like these layers of it, like, why am I sending invitations to a large event, right? Or do you handwrite thank you notes? And it's all of these things that it's like that you are even arguing over doing it at all is part of the argument, Right. But I mean, I think to your point about fiction, people love stories about that. Like that's Metropolitan, the Whit Stillman movie, or like any Donna Tartt novel. People love. I love
Donna Tartt too. Yeah,
yeah, and Bret Easton Ellis. I mean, I think everyone's even now, right? Everyone really wants to know about like class differences in the United States. Gossip Girl. There's a nice tradition of literature and film, even stuff that's actually literature, not a Donna Tartt novel.
That seems like a good segue to the stuff you've written on TikTok too. All right, so I'm an old and I don't have TikTok. And I don't have TikTok primarily not because I don't understand it. I think a lot of the ones that I see people put up on Twitter are really funny and like really amusing. But I can't get past the fact that it's owned by the CCP basically, and that it's kind of like if you want to do really stealthy influence, that's what I would do. Like if I was CCP and I'm like, I want to influence Western youth, right? I'm not going to put up posters of Mao or anything like that. I'm going to do TikTok. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. But if that's true, it's interesting what they're choosing to influence. Because I feel like, like something like Tumblr, which was much smaller by comparison, had a huge cultural impact. So does Twitter, as we discussed earlier. And a lot of that is like, who do you ultimately have access to, right? TikTok is really good at making music, television, and products go viral, including food, right? There's been so many cases of like older songs or like maybe candy that like no one really liked, but had, been on the market for 30 years, become viral and turn into a meme. And in some cases is now like a permanent fixture of, it's just a popular thing people eat. And it wasn't actually, sometimes it's ephemeral, sometimes it's not. Like one really weird example, this was the first one I personally noticed. Someone started like wrapping pickles in fruit roll-ups and then freezing them and putting chamoy and tahini on them. And it's a really weird snack, but now there's multiple like small businesses and stores where you can get like these customizable pickles. And now it's like frozen yogurt. It's just like kind of a thing that's like, oh, do you want frozen yogurt? Do you want ice cream? Do you want a pickle? Like, not in every city in the country. So some people might be hearing this and be thinking, what are you talking about? But like in the places where it's popular, it's very popular. And TikTok did that. And the TikTok is great at doing that. So it seems like if this is some sort of like Chinese op, maybe they're still in like the testing phase, like what can we get Americans to like or consume? Or it's sort of revealing that the ultimate goal is really about selling random stuff and how can we make money? How can we make such and such a band popular, or a lipstick that changes color with your skin pH, or whatever.
That's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
The idea, though, Edward Bernays, who was a massively bad human. I always append anything I say about him with what a fucker that guy was. But like he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he was the guy who rebranded propaganda to public relations. And like, that's masterful, I think.
Yeah, that's genius.
And what do you think about that? Do you think that we, with kind of the ascendancy of the TikToks of the world, those types of things, that we are just becoming this kind of ethereal, one thing, then the next, then the next, then the next, or is that too alarmist, thinking that it's shortening our attention spans to like goldfish?
It might be. I think we're a lot more malleable than we think. And I also think it would have been this bad earlier had we had the tools, right? Like something that's always like a nice wake-up call is to like review trends of the past and then actually like buy the product or experience it for yourself. Because, people in like the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, like crap has always been popular, right? Like a lot of like musicians we remember fondly like aren't really great. There's just something, they just have like a cultural cachet now, and that's time has given them that. So there's that aspect of it. We have, it's not like, I don't think it's a 21st century phenomenon that suddenly everything's like low quality garbage, right? I think things have been, since at least the 20th century, maybe earlier, right? Things have been not great. And by a certain metric. And as far as our attention spans, I think that is true. But I think it's so much easier to heal. And I think that we also have like a natural saturation point. It doesn't mean that we won't like immediately go back, but there's been all these articles written about like, Zoomers are Luddites or something. I think what ends up happening is like you reach a point where your existence is too mediated and you kind of get freaked out and you have like a self-imposed break. So it's like eating too much candy. Like your diet can be generally bad, but even if you're like someone who only eats fast food and candy all the time, in one sitting, right? Like at some point you have a stopping point and you're like, I need to take a break, right? And I think something we don't do is reflect on those breaks and then try to harness them and say, okay, what do we need to change? What we do is we give ourselves the space. I mean, we become a little antisocial or something, and then we just go right back to doing what we were doing. But I think it's alarmist to say like, well, we're stuck like this. The cat's out of the bag. I'm very online. I'm very attached to my devices, and this happens to me, and I'll take months off, and then I can read the same way I was able to read before I had a smartphone. And then the problem is I just go back, right, and all of the progress is gone, but it comes back, right? There's never at least at my age it's not I haven't reached a point of no return yet.
I think that's a good way of putting it too, because one of the things that I think is happening is we are moving from the era, as you mentioned, the 50s, 60s, 70s, where everything was mass production, right? And like everybody watched the same TV shows, everybody read the same books, and they were all mediated through gatekeeping. And now we've moved to the age, I think, of mass personalization. And the good news there is, for example, there's lots of niches, like your friend, the YouTuber. We now have the platforms and the technology where you can, if you're good, you can successfully, power laws aren't going away. They're going to be around forever. But now there are many hills, much smaller hills, like I Love Lucy, 63 million viewers for any one episode. The closest equivalent that we have adjacent now would have been the Game of Thrones finale with 18 million viewers.
Wow.
Considerably lower. But by the same token, there are now all sorts of things where you could earn a successful living. You could have a wonderful life if you really love what you're doing in a way that you never could have in the past, right? Like if your thing were, I don't know, Viennese or Austro-Hungarian Empire military tactics, and the internet didn't exist, that was going to be your little niche. And you might have a couple of nerdy friends that you could talk to about it, but that was probably it. And you were bound by where you were, right? So right. If you were in New York, probably going to find a lot more back to the New York theme as a gravity well. But if you were in Arkansas, you probably didn't have nearly as many to reach. Now with the internet, you've got everyone in the world who might be interested in that particular niche. And you could have a successful YouTube channel on it, a successful Substack. Do you share that view?
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think people think it's the opposite. I think people think that 40 years ago it was so much easier to have like a mom and pop hobby shop, and now you can't anymore. And I think it's like, well, now like you can in a place like, a small town Arkansas, because not only are the costs low, but if what you make up and people in the town not being interested in it, you have people who fly in, you can sell things online. It's actually like, if you play your cards right, it's much more sustainable. And I think what it is that people are trapped in like these nostalgia traps, and they don't update themselves, and they don't make it sustainable, even though, as you say, actually it's much easier in a way to do it now.
Yeah. And I also think typically nostalgia gets much more important to society during times of lots of volatility, right? Lots of changes happening. And it's my opinion, at least, that nostalgia is a yearning for a time that really never existed, right? Oh gosh, it was so much easier to have a mom and pop coffee shop back in the 50s. Oh, that'd be so great. No, it really wasn't that much
Yeah.
easier. And a lot of the times it really sucked. Like it was just really, really hard work. And we tend to put on our rose-colored glasses and say, "Oh, wasn't that an idyllic past?" No, actually, it wasn't.
Right.
Anytime anyone says to me, like, "Wouldn't it be great to be able to live in like the late 1800s?" And my answer is, "Fuck no, man." Like, if I got a sliver, I could die of sepsis because there are no antibiotics, right? And people tend to gloss over how hard life was for most humans up until pretty recently, right?
Yeah, and how, like, I think we also just forget how we always sort of look backwards. Like, this is again, like, sort of a well-trodden trope now, but like people, people in the 80s wish it was the 50s, people in the 90s wish it was the 60s. One thing that comes to mind as we're talking is like a conversation I have with like Zoomers a lot like my Zoomer siblings, for example. Oh, I wish Blockbuster was still around. I wish we could, I hate Netflix. I hate streaming. I wish I could just go in and there was a finite number of choices. And like, I remember being in like Blockbusters in like 1997, and then whoever I'm with, or even myself without even knowing what I'm talking about, being like, oh, like, I'm going to get a movie from the 80s. I wish it was like 1987, right? And it's like, why? Why do I wish that? Why is the adult that I'm with saying that, And just we're always looking backwards. We're always like reconstructing the past.
Yeah, I think a big part of that is part of human OS is a really strong desire for the illusion of certainty.
Yeah.
And so we get enamored of the past because in our minds it's fixed, it's certain. And we're uneasy, or we're anxious about now and the future because obviously it's not fixed, right? And there are a lot of different things going on. And when there's a lot of disruption, whether it's positive disruption or negative disruption, the human OS kind of reacts the same. And it's like, ugh, I don't like disruption. I don't want that. Tony DeMello had a great line, which is, everyone wants progress, but nobody wants change. And
yeah, I agree. That's a great way to put it.
and it's so funny to me because like I if there was a time machine, I'm going forward. I'm not going back because like, although Louis C.K. had the funny bit about how as a white male, he would only go back in time because he said, I could go back to 1 AD in Rome and they'd say, Mr. C.K., we have your table right here. And he goes, but I'm not going into the future. I'm the other way around. I think that we are like on the cusp here of like very, very cool things happening. Now, that doesn't mean they won't come without problems. Everything comes with problems. And I'm just hoping that they're better problems. What do you think about the debate right now that's going on about AI and about, the on the one hand, there are the people who are terrified, they see Terminator. And then on the other hand, there are the people who it's like, it's going to bring us to the singularity, et cetera. I think both sides of those extreme arguments are silly. But what do you think?
I'm not too scared of it. When I used to be really scared of AI in like 2011 or something, and I was in a relationship at the time with someone who had studied machine learning in grad school, and he said to me, he was like, think of every time you go to an airport and you go to get your tickets at one of the little kiosks, right? Those were supposed to make the desk attendants irrelevant, and they never work. And it's 2011, and now it's 2023, and those things still don't work. And I still always need to go up to the desk and ask, for my ticket and for my information. And his only point was like the technology always exists. Better technology than like I personally am even aware of has always existed, but the distribution and then getting people to cooperate with it is so difficult. And I never hear that piece brought into the conversation. Like ChatGPT is very good, but writing prompts is actually kind of difficult. And it's like you have to get people over so many hurdles that sometimes it's just easier to use human labor. And how long are we going to be in that situation before people are really made redundant? So that's one very important piece of it, I think.
Yeah, I think that AI will be the killer app of AI will be a bit like an iPhone, right, or an iPad, where you can just use it so intuitively that you don't have to, join a Discord or take a class in prompt engineering and all of that stuff. I think that that's probably coming a lot faster, at least from what I've seen. Now, admittingly, I'm involved in AI. I'm the chairman of Stability AI, which is the largest open source AI foundational model builder. But I see AI as kind of the greatest amplifier for human creativity and innovation to come along, and certainly the time that I've been watching tech. And but I also believe that AI should be for everyone. It should be all for all. The idea of a few people controlling AI just gives me images of the great panopticon. And, I have 5 grandchildren and I don't want them to grow up in that world. So I'm a much bigger believer in AI for all. But it's also, to your point, it's got to be almost intuitively easy to use.
Yeah.
Right? Because like I sometimes joke that when you let hardcore engineers do so-called upgrades on tech, it's actually a massive downgrade for regular people, right? Because the engineer has a certain way of thinking and they're like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could do, whatever it is, some, obscure arcane thing that is admittingly cool, but like completely superfluous to running like iTunes, for example. And I use iTunes as my example all the time because like when iTunes first came out, like I had everything, all my music was on iTunes. It was super simple. It was really easy to make playlists. It was just very convenient, very intuitive. Then throughout a series of upgrades with air quotes attached, it became unusable, like literally unusable. And, thank God Spotify came along and saved me.
Right.
But like, it seems to me that it's kind of table stakes to be able to give through a technology platform, to be able to give things that are way too complicated, and that the engineers love to make. What's really hard is to make things like an iPhone, like Spotify, like Amazon has become, right? In the old days, like I was one of the earliest users of Amazon, and you would call with your credit card information, like because people didn't. I didn't do that, but like my sisters who are true baby boomers did. Like, and I'm like, why are you doing that? Well, I would never put my credit card on the internet, and so I do see there's a cultural lag attached to everything, right? And that's the classic adoption curve.
Yeah. I think people really underestimate what that lag is going to be with AI. There's sort of this, like, I feel like there's a mythology that like after maybe like Gen X and everyone's like super comfortable with technology. I think I saw a study that like Zoomers are less comfortable than millennials, and millennials are largely like superstitious about AI. So I mean, the hurdle that we're going to have to get over with like getting millennials and Zoomers beyond people who are already receptive and interested to be using these tools too is I think going to be very difficult, even if we do have something like an iPhone that's very intuitive to use. And And I think even just convincing people to use tools that will make their lives better will create jobs, right? Zoomers really are tech illiterate for the most part, and they'll need help, right? And that in itself is an opportunity creator.
There you go. You've also written a lot about astroturfing on social media and elsewhere. That's another great example of something that has always happened, right?
Yeah.
Like during our little spat with our cousins from the UK, there were all sorts of newspapers that were driven entirely by political factions, and so they engaged in, quite. If you read them now, it's quite eloquent, but it was still astroturfing. Do you think, like, is that a pearl clutcher moment, or what do you think about the proliferation of either gaslighting or astroturfing in social?
It depends. I think there is a lot of alarmism around it. I think like it sort of depends. I mean, there's some obvious examples of it. It becomes most obvious when these attempts fail, right? Or when they don't cover their tracks well enough. But this sort of goes back to the AI point in a way. There's this disbelief that things can become organically popular online, and people misunderstand the way power can help, right? So they'll think, let's say a musician or a thought leader or something is totally astroturfed, when really what happened was they had organic momentum, and the thing that knocked them over the edge was a powerful person or celebrity then endorsed them and made or break their career, right? Whereas a lot of people will see a trajectory like that and think, oh, this person was totally astroturfed and totally invented. But they don't understand that, like, actually, like, someone writing a profile about you or something in the New York Times will give you that, like, last push you need to get, mainstream popularity or something. So I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding of how, again, like, to go back to our earlier conversations, how social capital works, how power works, how trends explode, how things grow. And it's easier to be like, oh, well, this was a plan, from so-and-so, and so nefarious.
Yeah, and that's right back to the Basquiat getting adopted by and promoted by Andy Warhol, right? Now he didn't. He did have a strong organic following. It just wasn't. Not many people knew about it because we didn't have the internet back then to have people put screen grabs of his stuff up on the internet. So what's next for you? What's the aspiration? What would you like to be the next chapter in the life, or are you just loving the current one?
I don't know. That's a good question. I am kind of getting burnt out with social media, although I always say that. I have a very love-hate relationship with it. On the one hand, it's made my career, which I'm very thankful for. On the other hand, it's a pain in the ass. I would love to get to a point where, like, I don't have to be so available, and the work will just speak for itself. I'll write a book or something, and that'll be, that'll be it. It's like I write books now or something. Who knows? Maybe the next chapter is I find a hobby and I, like, make miniature furniture for the rest of my days, and that's actually gives me purpose.
And then you write a book about miniature furniture making,
and then it's just a whole new world, right? It's like, I go to conventions. I have a TikTok.
I love it. Well, Katherine, this has been awesome. Thank you for taking the time. We have a question that we ask everyone at the end of the podcast, which is, we're going to make you Empress of the world. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. That's a no-no. Nor can you kill anybody. But we're going to hand you a magic microphone, and you can speak two things into it. And the next morning, whenever the morning happens to come for the 8 billion inhabitants of this little rock, everyone is going to wake up and they're going to think, I just had two of the greatest ideas and I'm going to start taking action against. I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to start taking action against both of them. What are you going to incept the entire population of the world with?
All right, that's a big question. Because it's so much. I don't want to pick the wrong things. All right, so this one I'm saying this has been outsourced to me by multiple people I trust. So I can't defend this. I'm just trusting my friends here. I'm very scared of climate change, so I'll say nuclear power, assuming my friends are right on that. Hopefully they are. And then for me personally, I would change the way the internet works. So it's more like Facebook events or Nextdoor than it is what we currently have. It's more like localized and in like little groups. So those are my probably gonna have terrible knock-on effects, but
I don't think that they're terrible. I think that like I changed my mind on nuclear power because of climate change. It's kind of like, you know what? I was wrong to be opposed to nuclear power. It is the cheapest, probably safest when you actually look into its history. I was opposed to it just because I didn't even like that was what you were, right? You were opposed to growing up when I grew up. It was just like you were. Of course, I don't want nuclear energy. and then when the whole climate change thing came up, I'm like, I better do a deeper dive on nuclear power. I was literally astounded. I'm like, holy shit, I was so wrong. And so I think that's a great one. And I've never seen Nextdoor, but I've heard about it.
I actually like it. No, I actually think it. I think it's actually really good. I tend to, my ideal internet usage is that it's a supplement to real life instead of easily replaced. Like you can't like live on Nextdoor, right? Like you use it to navigate your immediate environment. And so maybe not the whole internet's like that, but more of that, more supplementing and improving what's immediately in front of you versus a place that you can kind of escape into forever.
Okay. You know what? You've convinced me. You incepted me. I'm gonna go check out Nextdoor. And
your mileage may vary. I live in a great neighborhood, so that might be part of it.
I'm gonna hold you accountable. All right. Well, Katherine, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll can't wait to see what the next chapter evolves at.
Likewise. Have a great day.